When my husband passed away, my son yelled at me, "Don't show up at the funeral. You're too dramatic." I said nothing. The next day, he fell off his chair when he saw the list of heirs. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. The steady beep of the heart monitor had been my companion for 3 days. I sat beside Robert's hospital bed, holding his weathered hand, watching his chest rise and fall with each labored breath. After 45 years of marriage, I knew every line on his face, every freckle on his arms. The man who had been my everything was slipping away. Doreen. His voice was barely a whisper. I leaned closer, my ear almost touching his lips. I'm here, sweetheart. I'm right here. His fingers squeezed mine with what little strength he had left. Take care of yourself. Promise me. Don't talk like that. You're going to get better. But even as I said the words, we both knew the truth. The cancer had won. Robert's eyes found mine, clouded with pain, but still filled with love. I love you, Doreen. Always remember that. Those were his last words. The monitor's beeping turned into a long, flat tone that seemed to echo through my chest. Nurses rushed in, but I knew it was over. My Robert was gone. I sat there in stunned silence, tears streaming down my face, when the door burst open. Miles stormed in, his face flushed with anger rather than grief. "What did you do?" he demanded, his voice cutting through my shock like a knife. "Miles, your father just—" "I know what happened. The nurse called me 20 minutes ago." He glared at me as if Robert's death was somehow my fault. I should have been here. I stood up slowly, my legs shaky from sitting for hours. "I called you yesterday. You said you were too busy with work. Don't you dare blame me." Miles's voice rose, causing one of the nurses to look our way with concern. "You probably didn't even call the right number. You never could handle anything properly." The words hit me like a physical blow. Here I was, having just lost my husband, and my own son was attacking me. "Miles, please, this isn't the time." "You're absolutely right. This isn't the time for your dramatics." He moved toward me, his presence intimidating despite the fact that I was his mother. "I need to handle the arrangements now. Real arrangements, not whatever mess you'd create." I felt my heart breaking all over again. He was my husband. "Miles, I have the right. You have the right to go home and let me handle this like an adult." His words were sharp, deliberate. "Dad always said you got too emotional about everything." "Well, this is too important for emotions." Jessica, his wife, appeared in the doorway. She'd been waiting in the hallway, probably listening to every word. "Miles is right, Doreen. You look exhausted. You should go home and rest." The way she said my name, like it left a bitter taste in her mouth, made my skin crawl. Jessica had never liked me, though I'd never understood why. I'd always been nothing but kind to her. "I want to stay with him a little longer," I whispered, looking back at Robert's still form. Miles stepped between me and the bed. "The funeral home will be here soon, and I don't want you making a scene. You know how you get." "How I get?" I stared at my son. This man I'd carried for 9 months, raised, loved unconditionally. When had he become so cruel? "Miles, I'm his wife. I should be making these decisions." He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You can't even balance a checkbook, Mom. You think I'm going to trust you with Dad's funeral, with his memory?" Each word was a dagger. I felt myself shrinking, becoming smaller under his withering gaze. The nurses had finished their work and quietly left us alone with Robert's body. The room felt cold, sterile, nothing like the warm goodbye I'd imagined. "Just go home," Miles continued, his tone slightly softer but still firm. "I'll handle everything. The funeral home, the obituary, all of it. And don't even think about showing up at the funeral home tonight for the viewing. You'll just embarrass yourself." "I won't embarrass." "Yes, you will. You always do." He pulled out his phone, already moving on to more important matters. "Jessica will drive you home." I looked at Jessica, hoping to find some sympathy, some understanding from one woman to another. Instead, I saw only cold calculation. "Come on, Doreen, let's get you home where you belong." where I belong. Not at my husband's side, not making decisions about his funeral, not grieving with my family, home alone. As we walked toward the elevator, I turned back one last time to see Robert. Miles had already positioned himself beside the bed, pulling out his phone to make calls, taking charge, being the responsible son. I pressed my lips together to keep from crying out. Robert had always been proud of Miles, bragging about his business success, his beautiful wife, his expensive house. But had Robert seen this side of him? This cold, controlling man who couldn't even let his mother say goodbye properly? The elevator doors closed, and I caught my reflection in the polished steel. I looked old, fragile, exactly like the burden Miles seemed to think I was. But something deep inside me, a voice that sounded remarkably like Robert's, whispered that this wasn't over, that maybe, just maybe, Miles had underestimated me one too many times. The funeral home parking lot was nearly full when I arrived. I sat in my old Honda, hands gripping the steering wheel, watching people I'd known for decades walk through the front doors of Morrison and Sons Funeral Home. They were going to see my Robert, to pay their respects, to say goodbye, and I was sitting outside like a stranger. Miles had made it clear I wasn't welcome at the viewing, but I couldn't stay away. This was my husband, the man I'd shared my life with for 45 years. I deserved to be there, even if it was only from a distance. Through the large windows, I could see the gathering inside. The soft glow of the lights, people dressed in black, the flowers I should have chosen myself. Had selected everything without asking me a single question. Not the casket, not the flowers, not even the music that would be playing softly in the background. I recognized faces as people arrived. Mrs. Henderson from next door, the couple from the grocery store where Robert had worked for 30 years, even some of his old bowling teammates. They all looked appropriately sad, appropriately respectful. Some carried flowers or cards. Then I saw him. Miles stood near the entrance, playing the role of the grieving son to perfection. He wore a black suit I'd never seen before, probably bought specially for the occasion. Jessica stood beside him in an elegant black dress, her blonde hair pulled back in a style that made her look sophisticated and somber. They greeted each mourner with the right mixture of sadness and gratitude. Miles shook hands firmly, accepted condolences with gracious nods, and guided people toward the viewing room where Robert lay. He looked every inch the devoted son who had lost his beloved father. If only they knew the truth. I watched as the Kovacs approached Robert's oldest friends, people who had known our family since Miles was in elementary school. Mrs. Kovac embraced Miles, and I could see her lips moving, probably telling him what a wonderful man his father was, how proud Robert had always been of him. Miles nodded solemnly, his hand on her shoulder in a gesture that would look comforting to anyone watching, but I knew better. I knew that Miles hadn't visited his father more than 3 times during his entire illness. I was the one who had driven Robert to chemotherapy appointments, who had slept in hospital chairs, who had held his hand through the worst moments. Where was Miles then? Too busy with work, he'd always said. "You've got it handled, Mom." A tap on my passenger window made me jump. I turned to see Carol Martinez, my neighbor, peering at me with concern. "Doreen, honey, what are you doing out here?" I rolled down the window, feeling heat rush to my cheeks.
Ay, Carol.
I needed some air. Carol's brow furrowed. "Shouldn't you be inside with your family? How do you explain to someone that your own son has banned you from your husband's viewing, that you're sitting in a parking lot like a criminal because your child thinks you're too dramatic to properly mourn?" "Miles is handling everything," I said finally. "He thought it would be better if what?" Carol's voice was sharp. She'd always been protective of me ever since her own mother had died, and she'd seen how I'd cared for Robert. "He thinks I get too emotional." Carol stared at me for a long moment, then looked toward the funeral home entrance where Miles was still greeting mourners. "Doreen, that's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. You're his wife. You belong in there."
It's okay, Elite.
"Really, I said my goodbyes at the hospital." But that was a lie too. Miles had barely given me 5 minutes alone with Robert before taking over completely. Carol looked like she wanted to argue, but another conversation was about to begin. I pulled up behind us, forcing her to move. "I'll call you tomorrow," she said through the window. We need to talk. As she walked toward the funeral home, I saw her stop and speak to someone near the entrance. She pointed back toward my car, and I felt a flush of embarrassment. Now people would know. They'd know that Robert's widow was sitting alone in the parking lot while his son played host inside. The next hour was torture. I watched people come and go, some staying only briefly, others lingering longer. The Kowalskis brought their teenage grandson, the one Robert had taught to fish last summer. The boy looked lost and sad, the way teenagers do when they encounter death for the first time. Robert would have wanted me to comfort that boy, to share stories about their fishing trips, to help him understand that grief was okay. Instead, I sat frozen in my car, forbidden from offering the comfort I'd given for decades. As the evening wore on, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Miles and Jessica were standing near the guest book, and Jessica was writing down names and addresses. They were cataloging who came, probably planning thank you cards or keeping track of who might be useful later. But it was more than that. I watched Jessica lean close to Miles and whisper something, both of them glancing toward the parking lot where I sat. Jessica smiled, the kind of smile that never reached her eyes. They were enjoying this, my exclusion, my humiliation, my powerlessness. It entertained them. The realization hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't just about Miles thinking I was too emotional. This was deliberate cruelty. They wanted me to know my place, to understand that I was no longer part of the family, no longer someone whose feelings mattered. A new car pulled into the parking lot, and I recognized it immediately. Margaret Chen, the lawyer who had handled some business for Robert over the years. She was an elegant woman in her 50s, always impeccably dressed, always professional. What was she doing here? I watched as she approached Miles, shaking his hand with the formal politeness of a business relationship. They spoke for a few minutes, Miles nodding seriously, Jessica hovering nearby with that calculating look she always wore when money or important matters were being discussed. Then Margaret did something unexpected. She turned and looked directly at my car. Even from this distance, I could see her searching the parking lot until her eyes found mine. She raised her hand in a small wave, acknowledging my presence. Miles followed her gaze and saw me. Even from across the parking lot, I could see his jaw tighten with anger. He said something sharp to Margaret, who responded with what looked like a firm but polite refusal. Margaret walked away from Miles and Jessica, heading directly toward my car. Margaret Chen's gentle knock on my car window startled me from my thoughts. I quickly wiped my eyes and rolled down the window, embarrassed to be caught crying in a parking lot. Parking lot. Mrs. Morrison, I'm so sorry for your loss, Margaret said, her voice warm with genuine sympathy. Robert was a good man. Thank you. I didn't expect to see you here. Margaret glanced back toward the funeral home where Miles was watching us with obvious irritation. Actually, I came specifically to see you. Would you mind if I sat with you for a moment? I unlocked the passenger door, grateful for any human kindness after the isolation of the past 2 days. Margaret settled into the seat beside me, her presence somehow comforting in its calm professionalism. I know this is a difficult time, she began carefully, but Robert asked me to speak with you after the funeral. There are some matters we need to discuss. What kind of matters? My heart sank. Was this about debts I didn't know about? Problems with the house? I can't go into details right now, but Robert made some important decisions in his final months, decisions that will affect your future significantly. Margaret's eyes were kind but serious. I'll call you next week to set up a meeting. In the meantime, don't sign anything Miles might ask you to sign. Do you understand? Before I could ask what she meant, a sharp rap on Margaret's window made us both turn. Miles stood there, his face tight with anger. Margaret rolled down her window with calm composure. Miles, I was just expressing my condolences to your mother. She should be at home resting, Miles said curtly. This is too much stress for her. I'm sure your mother can decide what's appropriate for herself, Margaret replied smoothly. She's a grown woman. The tension between them was palpable. I didn't understand it, but I could feel undercurrents of something larger happening around me. I'll call you, Mrs. Morrison, Margaret said, squeezing my hand gently before getting out of the car. Take care of yourself. As Margaret walked back to her car, Miles leaned down to my window. What did she want? Just to pay her respects. His eyes narrowed. Did she say anything else about Dad's business or the house? No, nothing like that. The lie came easily. Instinctively, something told me Miles didn't need to know about Margaret's warning. Good, because you don't need to worry about any of that complicated stuff. Jessica and I will handle everything. His tone softened slightly, but it felt calculated rather than genuine. Why don't you go home? This has been a long day for everyone. I nodded, too emotionally drained to fight anymore. As I started my car, I watched Miles return to Jessica's side. They stood together, a united front, watching me drive away. The house felt impossibly empty when I got home. 45 years of shared life echoed in every room. Robert's coffee cup still sat in the sink from 3 days ago. His reading glasses lay folded on the side table next to his favorite chair. I picked them up, holding them against my chest as fresh tears came. The phone rang, jarring me from my grief. I almost didn't answer, but the caller ID showed Jessica's number. Hello, Doreen, it's Jessica. Miles and I are coming. We need to discuss some practical matters tonight. I'm really not up for this. Can't wait. We'll be there in 20 minutes. The line went dead before I could protest. I looked down at myself, still wearing the black dress I'd put on for the viewing I wasn't allowed to attend, and sighed. What practical matters were so urgent they couldn't wait until after Robert's funeral. When Miles and Jessica arrived, they came armed with folders, legal pads, and the kind of determined efficiency that made my stomach clench with anxiety. Sit down, Mom, Miles said, gesturing to the couch like he was the host and I was the visitor. We need to talk about your future. Jessica spread papers across the coffee table, her movements crisp and businesslike. We've been doing some research, and we think we've found the perfect solution for you. Solution for what? I asked. For your living situation, Miles said, settling into Robert's chair without asking. The sight of him there, so casual and assuming, made my heart ache. This house is way too big for you now. Too much maintenance, too many stairs, too many memories. I looked around the living room, where Robert and I had watched countless movies, where we'd celebrated Miles's birthdays when he was young, where we'd planned our future together. I don't want to move. This is my home. Be realistic, Mom. Jessica's voice had that patient tone people use with children or the elderly. You can't maintain a house this size on your own. The yard work alone would be impossible. I can hire help. With what money? Miles interrupted. Dad's medical bills wiped out most of the savings. The life insurance will help, but it won't last forever if you're trying to maintain this place.
My head spun.
Medical bills? Robert had good insurance. We'd always been careful with money. What are you talking about? Miles and Jessica exchanged a look that I was becoming familiar with, the look that said they knew things I didn't, that I was too simple to understand the complexities of real life. The experimental treatments Dad tried in his last months, Jessica explained with exaggerated patience, the ones insurance didn't cover. The private nurses, the special medications, it all adds up. I felt like I was drowning. Robert had never mentioned money problems, but then again, he'd always handled the finances. I trusted him completely. How much? I whispered. Don't worry about the exact numbers, Miles said quickly. The point is, you need to downsize. We found this lovely assisted living facility about 30 minutes away. It's clean, safe, and they have activities. Assisted living? The words felt foreign in my mouth. I don't need assistance.
I am perfectly capable.
For now, Jessica said gently. But what happens when you fall and break a hip? What happens when you can't drive anymore? You'd be stranded here. Miles leaned forward, his expression earnest. We're thinking ahead, Mom. We're being responsible. Dad would want us to make sure you're taken care of. The mention of Robert's wishes stung. How did they know what Robert would want? When had either of them spent enough time with him to understand his thoughts about anything? I need time to think about this, I said. Finally, of course, Jessica said, gathering up the papers, but don't take too long. The facility has a waiting list, and we were lucky to get you on it. After they left, I sat in Robert's chair, trying to make sense of what had just happened. In the space of one conversation, I'd gone from being a widow grieving her husband to being a burden who needed to be managed and relocated. I pulled out the folder Jessica had left behind, marked Sunset Manor Assisted Living. The brochure showed smiling elderly people playing bingo and doing crafts. It looked pleasant enough, but it wasn't home. As I flipped through the papers, one detail caught my eye. The monthly fee was nearly $3,000. If our finances were as dire as Miles claimed, how could we afford this place? Unless they weren't planning to pay for it themselves. The thought made my blood run cold. Were they expecting me to sell the house to pay for assisted living while they managed whatever assets remained? Was this their plan all along? I thought about Margaret Chen's warning not to sign anything, and suddenly it made perfect sense. The funeral was everything Robert would have hated. Too formal, too impersonal, filled with people who barely knew him but felt obligated to attend. I sat in the front row, officially designated as the grieving widow, but Miles controlled every detail of the service. The pastor, someone Robert had never met, spoke about a man I didn't recognize. He talked about Robert's successful business career and his pride in his accomplished son, but never mentioned Robert's love of fishing, his terrible jokes, or the way he sang off-key in the shower every morning for 45 years. I wanted to stand up and tell them about the real Robert, the man who cried at commercials with dogs, who still brought me flowers every Friday even after 4 decades of marriage, who spent his last weeks not worrying about his own pain, but about what would happen to me. But I sat silent, playing my assigned role while Miles delivered a eulogy that sounded more like a business presentation than a son's goodbye to his father. After the cemetery service, people gathered at the fellowship hall for lunch. Miles and Jessica worked the room like politicians, accepting condolences and thanks with practiced grace. I found myself sitting alone at a corner table, watching my son charm people who had known Robert far longer than Miles had bothered to. Mrs. Morrison, I looked up to find Margaret Chen standing beside my table. She wore a simple black suit and carried a leather briefcase, looking professional even in this informal setting. "May I join you?" I nodded, grateful for the company. Margaret settled into the chair across from me, setting her briefcase carefully on the floor. "How are you holding up?" "I feel like I'm watching someone else's life," I admitted, like I don't belong at my own husband's funeral. Margaret's expression. Procyon softened with understanding. Grief affects everyone differently. There's no right way to process such a loss. We sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the crowd of mourners. Miles was across the room, deep in conversation with Robert's former boss from the grocery store. Jessica stood beside him, her hand possessively on his arm. "Mrs. Morrison," Margaret said quietly, "I meant what I said at the viewing. We need to talk soon. There are things about Robert's final wishes that you need to know." My stomach tightened with anxiety. Was it bad news? Did Robert leave debts I didn't know about? Quite the opposite, actually. Margaret glanced around to make sure no one was listening. Robert was much more careful with money than your son realizes. He also made some very specific arrangements in his final months. What kind of arrangements? Margaret opened her briefcase and pulled out a sealed envelope. "Robert asked me to give you this after the funeral. He wrote it 6 weeks before he died, when he knew the cancer was winning." My hands trembled as I took the envelope. It was addressed in Robert's familiar handwriting. "For my beloved Doreen, when you're ready for the truth." "What truth?" I whispered. "Robert saw how Miles was treating you during his illness. The way he dismissed your opinions, spoke over you, made decisions without consulting you. It troubled him deeply." I thought back to those final months. Miles had insisted on dealing with all the doctors, claiming I was too emotional to handle medical information properly. He'd scheduled appointments without telling me, made treatment decisions without asking my opinion, and generally acted like I was an inconvenience rather than Robert's wife and primary caregiver. Robert felt terrible that he hadn't intervened sooner, Margaret continued. He said he'd always been too passive when it came to family conflicts, too willing to keep the peace. But watching Miles treat you like a child who couldn't be trusted with adult decisions, it opened his eyes. Across the room, Miles laughed at something someone had said. The sound grated against my nerves. How many times had he laughed at my expense over the years? How many times had he dismissed my concerns or made me feel foolish for having opinions? So, he changed his will, among other things? Yes, but there's more than just the will, Mrs. Morrison. Robert spent his final weeks making sure you would be protected, no matter what anyone else might try to do. Margaret's phone buzzed, and she glanced at it with a frown. I'm sorry, but I have to take this call. Can you come to my office tomorrow afternoon? Say 2 o'clock? I nodded, clutching the envelope against my chest. Should I tell Miles about this? Margaret's expression grew stern. I would strongly advise against it, at least not until after our meeting tomorrow. And remember what I told you about not signing anything. After Margaret left, I sat staring at the envelope in my hands. Part of me wanted to tear it open immediately, but another part I was afraid of what I might find inside. Robert had always been gentle, non-confrontational. What could he have written that required such secrecy? Mom, what was that about? I looked up to find Miles standing beside my table, his eyes fixed on the envelope. Jessica hovered behind him, trying to look casual but clearly listening intently. Mrs. Chun was just paying her respects, I said, sliding the envelope into my purse. What's in the envelope? Miles frowned. Nothing important, just some paperwork from your father's business dealings. Miles frowned again. What kind of paperwork? I thought I was handling all of Dad's business affairs. It's nothing urgent, I repeated, standing up from the table. I'm getting tired. I think I'll head home. Wait, I'll drive you, Miles said quickly. You shouldn't be driving when you're emotional. I'm fine, I said firmly. I've been driving for 50 years, Miles. I think I can manage the 10 minutes to my house. Jessica stepped forward with that false, sweet smile I'd grown to hate. We're just worried about you, Doreen. You've been through so much stress. I appreciate your concern, but I need some time alone. As I walked toward the exit, I could feel their eyes following me. I could sense their frustration at not being able to control this one small aspect of my day. In my car, I sat for a moment holding the envelope. Even through the paper, I could feel Robert's presence, his protective love reaching across the divide between life and death. Whatever was in this letter, whatever Robert had arranged, I had the feeling my life was about to change dramatically. For the first time since Robert's death, I felt something other than grief and confusion. I felt hope. That evening, I sat in Robert's chair with the envelope in my lap, working up the courage to open it. The house was quiet except for the ticking of the grandfather clock Robert had inherited from his father. Finally, I slipped my finger under the flap and carefully opened the envelope. Inside were 3 pages of Robert's careful handwriting, the words slightly shaky from the medication, but still clearly his. My dearest Doreen, it began. If you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you're probably feeling lost and alone. But I need you to know that you are not alone, and you are not the helpless woman Miles seems to think you are. My breath caught in my throat. Robert had seen it too. He'd noticed how Miles treated me. I've made arrangements to ensure your security and your independence. Margaret will explain everything, but I need you to be strong, my love, stronger than you've ever been. Our son has forgotten what you sacrificed for this family, but I never did. Tears blurred my vision as I read on, but Robert's final words made me sit up straighter. It's time for you to reclaim your life, Doreen. It's time to show them the woman I've always known you to be. Margaret Chen's office was nothing like the sterile legal environments I'd imagined. Warm wood paneling lined the walls, and family photos sat alongside law books on the shelves. She greeted me with genuine warmth, offering tea before we settled into comfortable chairs beside her desk. How are you feeling, Mrs. Morrison? Confused mostly and scared. I clutched my purse, where Robert's letter remained safely tucked away. I read Robert's letter last night. He mentioned arrangements, but he didn't give details. Margaret nodded, pulling a thick file from her desk drawer. Robert was very thorough. He spent weeks planning this, making sure every detail was legally sound and impossible to contest. Contest? Why would anyone want to contest his will? Because, Margaret said gently, it's not what Miles is expecting. She opened the file and removed a document I recognized as Robert's original will, the one we'd signed together 5 years ago. It was straightforward enough. Everything split between Miles and me, with the house going to me for my lifetime, and then to Miles. This is the will Miles knows about, Margaret explained. The one he's counting on. Then she pulled out another document, this one much newer. And this is the will Robert actually filed 3 months ago. My hands shook as I took the papers. The legal language was dense, but certain phrases jumped out at me. Sole beneficiary, irrevocable trust, and most shocking of all, conditional inheritance limited to $5,000. I don't understand. What does this mean? Margaret leaned forward, her expression serious but kind. It means Robert left you almost everything, Mrs. Morrison. The house, his life insurance, his investments, his pension.
It all goes to you.
Miles receives $5,000 and Robert's personal effects only. The room seemed to spin around me.
But why?
I mean, I'm grateful, but Miles is his son. Robert felt that Miles had shown his true character during the final months of his illness. The way he excluded you from medical decisions, spoke to you dismissively, treated you like an inconvenience rather than a wife and mother. Margaret's voice carried a hint of steel. Robert documented several specific incidents that influenced his decision. I thought about those awful months, the constant feeling of being pushed aside, of having my concerns dismissed as emotional or unrealistic. I'd assumed Robert hadn't noticed that he was too focused on his illness to see how Miles was treating me. There's more, Margaret continued. Robert also discovered that Miles had been pressuring him to change the original will months ago, before the cancer diagnosis. Miles wanted the house left directly to him, not to you with lifetime rights. My stomach dropped. He what? Miles argued that it would be more efficient for estate planning purposes. He suggested you could live in the guest room or move to a smaller place. Robert was disturbed by the conversation, especially since you knew nothing about it. The betrayal hit me like a physical blow. While I was caring for Robert, nursing him through chemotherapy, Miles had been maneuvering to take away my home. But there's something else you need to understand, Margaret said, her tone becoming more urgent. Robert included a spec. If Miles attempts to contest the new will or challenge it in any way, he forfeits even the $5,000. Everything would then go to charity in Robert's name. He thought of everything. He did, but Mrs. Morrison, there's one more thing. Robert also left detailed instructions about timing. He specifically requested that the will not be read until 1 week after the funeral. He wanted to see how Miles would behave toward you during that time. I felt a chill run down my spine. He was testing him in a way. Yes, Robert hoped Miles might show some genuine concern for your welfare, some sign that he understood his responsibilities as your son. But Margaret gestured toward another folder. I've been monitoring the situation as Robert requested. Your neighbor, Carol Martinez, called me yesterday. My face burned with embarrassment. What did she tell you? That Miles and Jessica came to your house the night after the viewing to pressure you about selling and moving to assisted living? That they claimed financial problems that don't actually exist? That they're essentially trying to manipulate you into giving up your independence? The full scope of Robert's planning became clear. He hadn't just changed his will. He created a safety net to catch me when Miles inevitably revealed his true intentions. What happens now? Now we schedule the official will reading. I'll call Miles and Jessica today to arrange a meeting for tomorrow morning. They'll come here expecting to inherit everything. Margaret's smile was grimly satisfied. They're going to get quite a shock. The next morning, I sat in Margaret's conference room, my hands folded in my lap, trying to appear calm. Miles and Jessica arrived precisely on time, both dressed in somber business attire. They'd brought a legal pad and pen, ready to take notes on their inheritance. Thank you all for coming, Margaret began formally. We're here for the reading of Robert Morrison's last will and testament. Miles straightened in his chair, his expression appropriately serious, but with an underlying eagerness that made my stomach turn. Jessica had her pen poised over the legal pad, ready to record their windfall. Before we begin, Margaret continued, I should mention that this will was executed 3 months ago, superseding any previous versions. Miles frowned slightly. 3 months ago? I thought Dad's will was settled years ago. People often update their wills as circumstances change, Margaret said smoothly. Now, shall we proceed? She began reading the formal legal language, the standard opening phrases that meant nothing to laypeople. Miles fidgeted impatiently, obviously wanting to skip to the important parts. Then Margaret reached the meat of the document. To my beloved wife, Doreen Morrison, I leave my entire estate, including but not limited to the family home and all real property, all bank accounts and investments, my life insurance policies, and my pension benefits. Miles jerked forward in his chair. Wait, what? Margaret continued reading, her voice steady. And professional to my son Miles Morrison, I leave the sum of $5,000 and my personal effects, including my tools, books, and sporting equipment. The silence in the room was deafening. Miles stared at Margaret as if she'd spoken in a foreign language. Jessica's pen had stopped moving entirely. That can't be right, Miles said finally, his voice strained. There must be some mistake. There's no mistake, Margaret replied calmly. This will was properly executed and witnessed. It represents your father's final wishes. Miles shot to his feet, his face flushing red. This is insane. Dad wouldn't have done this. Someone manipulated him, probably while he was on medication and not thinking clearly. Your father was mentally competent when he signed this will, Margaret said firmly. I can provide medical documentation to that effect if necessary. Jessica finally found her voice. But what about the medical bills, the debts? Doreen can't handle all of that responsibility. What medical bills? Margaret asked with raised eyebrows. Robert had excellent insurance. His final medical expenses totaled less than $3,000 out of pocket. The look of shock on Jessica's face would have been comical if the situation weren't so tragic. They'd built their entire manipulation around fictional debts. Miles began pacing behind his chair. I don't care what that paper says. I'm contesting this will. Dad wasn't himself at the end. Anyone could see that. Margaret's expression grew cold. I should inform you, Miles, that your father anticipated this reaction. There's an additional clause in the will. She turned to a new page and read, should my son Miles Morrison attempt to contest this will or challenge its provisions in any legal proceeding, his inheritance shall be reduced to $0, and his designated $5,000 shall instead be donated to the Alzheimer's Association in my name. Miles stopped pacing, his face going pale. He can't do that. He absolutely can, and he did. Margaret closed the will and looked directly at Miles. Your father also left a sealed letter explaining his decision. Would you like me to read it? Miles sank back into his chair, looking stunned. Jessica grabbed his arm, whispering urgently in his ear. For the first time since Robert's death, I found my voice. Yes, I said quietly. I think we should hear what Robert wanted to say. Margaret opened the sealed envelope with careful precision. Inside was a single sheet of paper in Robert's handwriting. She cleared her throat and began to read. Miles, if you're hearing this letter, it means you've learned about my final will and you're probably angry. I hope you'll take a moment to understand why I made these decisions. For 45 years, your mother has been the strongest, most selfless person I've ever known. She worked 2 jobs to help put you through college. She cared for my mother during her final illness, without complaint. She nursed me through cancer with a devotion I never deserved. But during my final months, I watched you treat her like she was incompetent. You spoke over her in doctor's appointments. You excluded her from decisions about my care. You acted as if her decades of sacrifice meant nothing. The final straw came when you suggested I leave the house directly to you instead of ensuring your mother's security. You said it would be more practical. What you meant was more convenient for you. Doreen has earned the right to live in peace and dignity. She has earned the right to make her own decisions without your interference. I pray that someday you'll understand that being a son means more than waiting for your inheritance. Margaret folded the letter and set it aside. The silence in the room was suffocating. Miles sat frozen, his face a mix of anger and something that might have been shame. Jessica's mouth hung open, her careful composure finally cracked. Miles, I said softly, your father loved you, But he loved me too, and he saw how you were treating me. Miles looked at me with eyes I barely recognized. You turned him against me. No, I said, finding strength I didn't know I had. You did that yourself. Jessica suddenly stood up, her voice sharp with desperation. This is ridiculous. Doreen doesn't know how to manage money or property. She'll lose everything within a year. Margaret's voice cut through Jessica's protest like a blade. Mrs. Morrison managed the household finances for 45 years while working full-time and raising a child. I think she's more capable than you give her credit for. But the house is too big for her, Miles said, grasping for any argument. She admitted she can't maintain it. Actually, I said, surprising myself with my calm tone, I never said I couldn't maintain it. You said I couldn't maintain it. There's a difference. Margaret smiled at me encouragingly. Mrs. Morrison, you now have the financial security to hire whatever help you need. Housekeeping, yard work, home repairs. It's all manageable with proper planning. The reality of my situation was beginning to sink in. I wasn't destitute. I wasn't helpless. I wasn't dependent on Miles's grudging charity. Robert had made sure of that. Miles made one last desperate attempt. What about when she gets older? What about when she can't live alone anymore? Then she'll make that decision when the time comes, Margaret said firmly, as an independent adult woman, not as someone whose choices are dictated by relatives who view her as a burden. Jessica grabbed her purse, her face twisted with fury. This is insane. Come on, Miles, we don't have to listen to this. But Miles didn't move. He sat staring at the table, processing the magnitude of what had just happened. The inheritance he'd counted on, the house he'd planned to sell, the control he'd expected to have over my life. All of it had vanished. Miles, I said gently, you're still my son. This doesn't have to change that. He looked up at me with bitter eyes. Doesn't it? You got what you wanted. You won. I didn't want to win anything. I just wanted to be treated with respect. Jessica tugged at Miles's arm. We're leaving. This is ridiculous. They reached the door. Miles turned back for a moment. I thought he might apologize, might show some recognition of what Robert's letter had tried to tell him. Instead, he said, don't come crying to us when you realize you can't handle this responsibility. Then they were gone, leaving Margaret and me alone in the conference room. How do you feel? Margaret asked gently. I considered the question carefully. Free, I said finally. For the first time in months, I feel free. 3 months later, I stood in my kitchen making coffee on a Saturday morning, watching through the window as the lawn service crew finished the weekly yard work. The house sparkled from the monthly deep cleaning service, and the handyman had just finished repairing the loose banister I'd been worried about. Robert had been right. With proper financial planning, maintaining the house wasn't a burden at all. I'd joined a book club at the library, something I'd never had time for when I was working. I'd started taking watercolor classes at the community center. I'd even begun volunteering at the local animal shelter, something I'd always wanted to do but never felt I could afford the time. My phone rang, interrupting my peaceful morning. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize. Hello? Mom? My heart stopped. It was Miles. Miles, how are you? His voice sounded different, uncertain in a way I hadn't heard since he was a child. I've been thinking about what Dad wrote in that letter. I waited, not wanting to say anything that might make him retreat into anger again. Jessica and I separated, he said quietly. She couldn't get over the money. She kept saying we should have gotten more, that you'd manipulated Dad somehow. I finally realized she'd never really cared about me, just what she thought I'd inherit. I'm sorry, Miles. I know that must be difficult. Mom, can I come see you? I want to really talk, not just about money or practical things. I want to understand what Dad was trying to tell me. Tears sprang to my eyes. Of course you can come. You're always welcome here, even after how I treated you. I thought about Robert's letter, about his hope that someday Miles would understand what being a son really meant. Especially then, I said softly. That afternoon, Miles sat in his father's chair, looking smaller somehow than he had in Margaret's office. We talked for hours, really talked for the first time since he was a teenager. He apologized for the way he treated me during Robert's illness, for assuming I was too emotional or incompetent to handle adult responsibilities. "I don't know why I did that," he said, his voice thick with regret. "You raised me alone for years after Dad's accident at the plant. You managed everything. Then I guess I just got used to thinking of you as someone who needed taking care of instead of someone who had always taken care of everyone else." "Your father saw it too," I told him. "That's why he wrote that letter. He wanted you to remember who I really was." As the sun set, Miles held me prepare dinner, something we hadn't done together since he was in high school. We cooked Robert's favorite meal and shared stories about him, both of us crying and laughing as we remembered the man who had loved us both enough to teach us this difficult lesson. "Will you forgive me?" Miles asked as he prepared to leave. "I already have," I said, hugging him tight. "But more importantly, you need to forgive yourself. Your father didn't want to punish you, Miles. He wanted to protect me and help you become the man he knew you could be." 6 months after Robert's death, I no longer felt like I was living someone else's life. The house was still full of memories, but they were comforting now rather than painful. I'd found my own rhythm, my own independence, my own strength. Miles visited every Sunday, and we were rebuilding our relationship on a foundation of mutual respect rather than obligation. He'd started therapy to work through his controlling tendencies, and he was learning to see me as a person rather than a responsibility. Robert's final gift hadn't just been financial security, it had been the chance to reclaim my identity as a capable, independent woman. He'd forced both Miles and me to confront the truth about our relationship and find a healthier way forward. As I sat in the garden Robert had planted for me, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and pink, I felt his presence, like a warm embrace. He'd kept his promise to take care of me, even after death. He'd given me back my life, and for the first time since he'd been gone, I could honestly say I was not just surviving, I was thriving. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below, and meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.